Okay, so I'm Asma Jhina. I'm a public policy specialist, and my academic background is anthropology actually, anthropology and linguistics. So when I first started working, I used to work for the civil society sector. I did research, communications, lobbying. Then I moved to government, where I did policy work, and then I joined central government. So I worked for the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism, where I was head of local strategic communications. So I did a lot of work around security and counter-terrorism. I did some work in Pakistan, in the Middle East, and then I went out to the High Commission in Delhi, where I developed the India-specific strategy as well. So I became quite specialist, I guess. I was then asked to join the London Organising Committee for 2012, and there I was head of policy for security operations. So my role was to write down on paper what the security policies and procedures would be. So who are we searching, who are we screening, how are we doing it, if somebody wants to bring, if there's a religious and orthodox Sikh person and they want to bring a kirpan, which is like a dagger, how do we incorporate that? If somebody's wearing a headscarf because they're Muslim, how do we search them? If somebody has medical requirements, how do we search them without triggering the trace detection? So a lot of equality and diversity, a lot of human rights impacts were taken into account in terms of how we do the searching and screening and how we treat people with respect and dignity. It also involved everything, so it was CCTV images, what is the legislation, how long can we keep the legislation, how do we screen people, how do we treat the dogs that we use for the drug detection and the trace detection. If you find something, how do you escalate it, how do you protect people, how do you make sure that they don't panic, how do you do crowd control. So it took into account a lot of sort of operating policies and procedures across the entire Olympic Games. But it also looked at planning. So a lot of the procedures that I wrote, for example, were around if we have waste bins. So I would have to speak to the waste management department. If we're going to have waste bins because people can't bring water into the Olympic Park, for example, they need to drop their bottles. How are we going to recycle that? How do we make sure it's not a security issue? Which bin does that bottle go in? Where does the food packaging go? Are we allowing food in? Because for commercial reasons, we wanted to minimise them. You know, you want to minimise how much food people can bring in, but equally you don't want to stop. If people have dietary requirements, if they have diabetes and they need food regularly, you don't want to say you can't bring food in. So how do you balance all of those commercial challenges while still creating a spectator experience that's fun, that's inclusive, etc., etc.? What we did was that I consulted with all the stakeholders, looked at good practice and developed what should be the policy and the procedure for the London Olympics. That then went into training for, I think in the end it was something like 26,000 security guards. But that also included testing them. So what you would have is you would have a test event, and you would say, okay, in the Olympic Games there's going to be 20,000 people in this venue, but we're going to scale it up. So for a concert we've got 10,000 people in this venue. How long is it going to take them? Does this work? Can we have the bins here? Can we have the X-ray machine here? You know, how are we going to search this person that's wearing a veil or a headscarf, etc.? So we use testing. So I was involved in the readiness, the testing, the exercising, and then all of that went into the training. And then during the Olympic Games, I was in the control room and we had a quality assurance role to make sure that we did spot checks. So are you doing what the policy says, or are you just doing what you want to do? You know, so we had to make sure that the level of service that we provided was exactly what we had written down in the documents and that they'd been trained to. But because there's so many people, you have to check. Because some people miss a day of training, other people are covering for a shift that they're not trained for, etc. There's so many people working. Again, what do you do with a ticket? What do you do? How do you screen a child? If you're using X-ray machines, how do you make sure that children aren't separated from their parents? How do you keep families together? How do you screen somebody who might be wearing a religious necklace? All of these issues. And then Sochi asked me to, so for Sochi, they were not, it was a different structure to LOCOG. So whereas in LOCOG, the Home Office and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport gave us the money to deliver the security operations. In Sochi, the state agency would do that. So they have a very different structure. So I was advising them on the best practice. So both come with their pros and cons, okay? So both have positives and both have very complicated situations. In London, it was easier because you could integrate the operation with, for example, waste management, with stewarding, with venue management, with the sports team, etc. In Sochi it was different because the state agency said security is what we do, we are the police, we do it, you do everything else. So there's less dialogue, but equally it was difficult in London because it was grant funded, so we had the government involved in our governance structure, which other departments didn't because they just used the structure for the organising committee. So neither is better than the other. They both have their own challenges. They both have their own positive angles as well. One of the things that I found in Sochi is that whereas in the UK we're quite advanced in terms of our equality and diversity, so how you treat people from different religions or how you treat people with different needs, abilities, medical issues, where I feel that in UK at least, we're a lot more advanced than a lot of other countries in our thinking. And I felt that was very helpful for Sochi because they were, for example, with the LGBT issues recently, you know, the policies around LGBT individuals in the UK are much more, the conversations are more advanced than they were in Sochi, in Russia generally. My role was more about advising them that when you carry out a security process, how do you impact on these people? So doing an impact assessment, how do you minimise those risks but still make sure that your security is the best that it can be? So there's a level of customer service as well. But also in terms of the legacy issues, so around waste management, how many plastic bags you use, how you dispose of knives, how you dispose of needles, how you dispose of drugs, because a lot of people come to these games with drugs on them, with marijuana or whatever. How do you protect your staff? Because they remove them off the individual, but if it's a criminal item, how do you tell the police? What happens to that person? There's an escalation process there as well. So quite complicated in some cases. I consulted, so security industry, obviously, so the police, and then guard company? Yeah, we had G4S, for example. We then had the Ministry of Defence, because we had the military come in to do some of the roles because we were short-staffed through G4S. Also BAA, because they have great practice around, when you go to an airport, you know, their practice of security operations is fantastic. So with BAA, also with waste management companies, with people that do disposal, provision of x-ray machines, provision of all kind of physical security equipment, the venue management as well, the stewarding. So we had to integrate. One of the other things was negotiating with our security provider how much they would pay their security guards and what kind of training they would provide. So one of the things that LOCOG specifically did as an organisation was say that we want all our security providers, to the extent that you can, to be recruited locally. So we want a certain percentage of people to come from the area that they're going to be working in East London, and we want to target people who are on welfare and they need training, so we want you to give them training, and we want you to give them a minimum wage of £8.50 an hour, which is a London living wage. So those were sustainable, those were legacy issues that were very, very important. And that's not just security, that's stewarding, everybody who worked for the Olympic Games, really, really important. We had many internal groups, so within the organising committee itself, there were many groups. So I sat on a group that was around integration, so this is what we're thinking about in terms of security, how does that impact what you're doing? So for example, if we find an item in a particular part of the venue that we think is suspicious, a bomb, for example, and you evacuate everybody, then I need to know how you're going to then bring all those people back to the venue within the time that the game needs to start. So conversations with venue management, with stewarding, with staffing, that how do these people get paid? How do you communicate that actually you're going to be working for 2 more hours because we had to evacuate, and then you're going to be working longer? All those things, for example. Logistics. So if the day's going to be really hot and we need more water, for example, how are we going to make sure that we get the water through security in time for all those people that are watching a particular game, for example? So I would have meetings at that level about integration, but there were many other meetings around budget, around resources, around risk management, around risk mitigation. There were layers upon layers upon layers of governance, and not just for the organising committee, but also the IOC and also government, so Home Office and Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Yeah. We had a very rigorous process. So we had we started out with the concept of operations. So this is a general idea of how it's going to look, and through every single point we did an impact assessment. So we need to search and screen everybody. Well, what are the kinds of people that are going to come? There's going to be old people, young people, disabled people, male, female, religious. You just have to do an impact assessment. And then you take that through, I set up various working groups, so I would take that through various experts. We had a disability group, for example, and we asked them to look at some of our issues. We had an association for Sikh communities. We talked to them about how they feel, because Orthodox Sikhs have 5 articles of faith. So they wear a turban, they carry a dagger, they have there are 5 things that they do which identifies them as Orthodox Sikhs. So we had a dialogue with them, with representatives of the community, to say, what do you think needs to happen in this situation? What is acceptable? How is a respectful way of making sure that we're not, so for example, the Buddhist, I can't remember the name now, but the Buddhists carry a box which is quite sacred. So if there's a Buddhist person who comes through, how do we make sure that we can make sure there's nothing in there, but still treat it with respect? And for that, we had working groups, so we would go to representatives in the community to say, what is the good practice? So yeah, a lot of consultation with a lot of different interest groups. I think the biggest challenge for any Olympic Games, any sporting games, is that you just don't realise how big they are. So you start off with a 1-page document and you say, we are going to save 1 ton of waste and we're going to recycle. And by the time that you've had the Olympic Games, the scale is so big that you've got 20 tons, of waste, for example, that you need to have disposed of because you've made a commitment 8 years ago. So it's the scale that actually, no matter how big you think the issue is, it will only get bigger. The problem only grows and grows and grows, and the closer you get to delivering the Olympic Games, the more pressure you have and the less time you have. That's I mean, my biggest challenge was always, any other project that I'd worked on, you could say, okay, I need a 2-week extension, publication is going to be delayed by a month, the workshop's going to be delayed till 6 months. You can do that, but when you have an Olympic Games, the opening ceremony is at 7:30 on the 27th of July, and nobody can move that. That's the date, So all your sustainability commitments have to be met, and they have to be met by that date. You have to deliver. That's the biggest challenge, time. But I had experts, consultants, venue security managers, I had government working groups. A lot of my job was stakeholder management, so a lot of my job was understanding what the security manager needed, what government wanted, what my boss wanted, what the interest group wanted, and then saying, okay, this is the policy, let's get it signed off. The legacy of every game is that they've done something that's gone well. So I would say that on the sustainability side, on the equality side, on the dignity, human rights side, London did really, really well. We didn't have any major issues at all. Things were resolved quite well. So the lessons learned are there are processes that we've developed that Tokyo can use, and it would depend on the structure that Tokyo is going to have. You know, so how many people, where are they going to be from, and also by 2020 there will be other issues. So it might not be LGBT, it might be so. For example, one of the policies that we had for the security was that women could only be patted. You know, when you go to an X-ray machine and it beeps, and then somebody pats you down, yeah? So women can only pat down women, men can only pat down men. But what do you do if you're not sure if it's a man or a woman, or if they're transgender, they used to be a man, they're now a woman, they used to be a woman, they're now a man, what do you do? So policies like that will only become increasingly more important. So maybe the issue in Tokyo will be, actually, this is something we need to pay more attention to. How are we going to deal with somebody who may look like a man, but says, actually, I'm a woman and I can only be patted down by a woman, for example. So issues like that.